As Katherine walked down the tight, dimly lit alley, she noticed the sound of her heels echoing off the grimy walls. Being aware of the sound also made her aware of the pressure on her feet as her heels struck the uneven path below. She had the usual day at work, her boss giving her mountains of work to complete with impossible deadlines and the stress that always builds throughout the day. She knew this was a dangerous alley sometimes, and there had been reports of bad things happening, but she had to get home quickly to have just a little time to relax by herself and catch her favorite show. She continued walking at a brisk pace, deep in thought, trying to complete tomorrow's work in her head. She heard a faint noise behind her. It jolted her out of her thoughts, and she could hear the pulsing of her heart in the back of her neck, the pressure and stress of the day making it worse. It was probably a rat or stray cat, she thought, as she scanned the alleyway behind her, straining her eyes in the gloomy light. It was probably one of those rats, she thought. The rats had grown large around here, feasting on all sorts of dead, rotting things, sometimes even bodies. Then another sound. This time she heard a bump on the dumpster just behind her. She was a little startled, as a rat couldn't make such large thud. She picked up her pace slightly. She could feel the pressure of her heels hurting a little more as they sent out the sound that echoed off the walls. She was thinking of ways to try and catch a glance at what was behind her. She continued walking, and then suddenly stopped and turned around to try to see. She started again with 2 steps and then quickly turned around again. Nothing there. I am wasting time with this, she thought, and continued at her rapid pace. Not long, and she would have shaved so much time off her walk home. She was back to her thoughts of the day and how she disliked her job. It wasn't as satisfying as when she started a few years ago. A sudden wretched smell jolted her back to reality. It was putrid, and it filled her nose and mouth as she tried to exhale it all out. There it was again, a sound, this time directly behind her in the alleyway a little way off. She turned her head slightly to look over her shoulder and caught a glimpse of a figure. She picked up the pace to a trot and then into a run. Her feet felt unsure on the rough terrain of the alley. If I lose my balance, I would be easy picking for whoever I saw behind me. She needed to see who was behind her. The curiosity was killing her. Was it someone or just her mind making up something there, tricking her eyes into seeing something? Let me have one more glance behind me. She turned her head slightly once again to glimpse who was behind her. Her eye picked up something, but she was still unsure. She confirmed it was someone behind her, but it was not chasing her. It was standing, watching, motionless. Katherine burst out of the alleyway onto the main road once again, panting and struggling to catch her breath fully. Just a little more, and she would be safe at home, relaxing. What a long day she was in her thoughts again. Who was the person in the alleyway? Had they seen her before taking that same shortcut, and could they still be following her? Maybe they weren't even following her at all. It could have been someone else taking the same route to shave off some distance on the way home. Her apartment was in sight. The long staircase would be difficult today after all the running, her feet now throbbing and aching. One quick look again before you go into the building, she reminded herself. In the distance, is that the same figure as before? Were they following her home? She was through her security door at the bottom of the building. She slammed it shut with so much relief and joy that she made it home. She locked the door and checked it was locked. Maybe her stress from work was catching up with her and her imagination was running wild. She could be really exhausted. People sometimes hallucinate different things if they are tired and overstressed. I'm just tired, she said to herself out loud. It didn't matter anymore as she was safe now at home. I'm going to rest my legs for a little bit. I'll have a seat on the couch for a few minutes, she thought as she drifted off. She forgot to draw the curtains, he thought to himself, as he looked at her sleeping, his eyes piercing through the glass. I missed you this time, but next time I may be luckier. Climbing the fire escape was a bold move he couldn't pass up. He was feeling a little more confident. Maybe he could get the window open and wouldn't need to wait. The window felt shut, but he pulled a little more on it. A little more, he thought it may just be stuck. The wood scraping sound escaped the frame and echoed through the apartment. What was that? Her body jolted awake. She was on the couch still. My upstairs neighbors are always making a noise, and I must have drifted off a little. It's 12:30. I need to get to bed as I have an early start tomorrow, she sighed. The next day was full of the same dance at work. Too many new tasks and not enough time to get the piled-up tasks done. 10:30 time to head home. You left it too late this time again, she scolded herself. She came down the road to the inevitable fork she would have to take. The dark alley was the best option. It was already late and she was tired. Next time, she should take her sneakers and change into them after work so walking would be easier. Also, if she did need to run, she would be able to. The alley seemed a little dimmer. Are some of the lights out? Katherine questioned her memory. She had a shiver break out all over her body as the cold shot through her. It was colder and darker this evening. It was just a short trip through this alley one more time and she would have made it home again. The shadows seemed to creep up around her, surrounding her like some sort of giant evil hand. Were they trying to pull her back into the darkness where she would never escape? Something is behind me, she felt a presence. As she turned, she saw it a hefty rat wet with the stench of the sewer water wafting off it. She stomped her foot at it loudly. The filthy rat turned and slowly walked off into the darkness, not really caring about what she had done. Maybe it was the biggest one around here, and it knew she wouldn't do anything to it. How did it get so big on garbage she was in her head again as she hurried along? Maybe it had been eating bodies of dead things in the alley. It's possible it was human bodies after all. Could be the reason it wasn't scared of her. A shiver then ran down her spine. It felt like frigid water had been poured down the back of her blouse. This was no rat. It was bigger, more sinister feeling. She turned and saw a figure standing in the gloom of the spattering lights. His face was hidden by the shadow, but she could feel his eyes locked with hers. There was a contortion in her stomach. It felt like it was pulling itself up into her chest. Her mouth was dry, and she felt the individual drops of perspiration on her forehead starting to bead up already. She would need to be fast, but she could make it. Back up slowly, she thought, like one would do with a dangerous animal. She slipped her feet out of her heels very slowly and carefully. There was no room for the slightest error. Then the fastest she could, she turned and took off down the alley. Her hair and coat seemed to move in slow motion compared to her head and body. Her lungs burning, she ran like a child running from a rabid dog. She turned slightly to see if he was following her. He was not far from where he was standing. What? She was almost angry. I ran, and he is not even chasing me. She felt a sharp, icy pain in her left foot. Had he thrown something or set a trap? As the weight came down on her left foot again, she knew there was something wrong. The burning intensified, and her knee buckled like the pain was so bad it had shut off the nerves. Her balance was gone. She rolled over her shoulder onto her back and back onto her feet. It was a broken bottle she had stepped on, the glass piercing right through the top of her foot. "Keep running, Katherine, don't stop," she was pleading with herself. Had she saved a few minutes of time with the shortcut only to hand them over to some horrific murderer who would kill her and leave her to the rats in the alley, or maybe he would tuck in as well? There was a weird sensation starting in her leg. It was getting heavier and feeling numb. She felt the pressure in her head drain out, and she could feel the blood trickling out of her foot with every limp. She glanced over her shoulder as she ran. He was closing in on her. The opening to the main road was close. He had realized she may make it and picked up the pace just enough to ensure she doesn't make it. But was it enough? He wasn't too worried about losing her, as he had hunted before. Tracking was in his nature. He chuckled to himself, and it slowly turned into a full, maniacal laugh. She heard his shoes striking the ground, and then a horrific laugh. "I'm in trouble," she said to herself as she tried to push a little harder, her blood burning with fear. "A little more, Katherine," she was desperately pleading. A few more strides and she would make it. He had made up a lot of distance and was just out of reach. He raised his hand to grab her blouse, flowing in the wind behind her. It was running through his fingers like water, but it was so light and soft. He tried to grasp it, but it was dancing too erratically, teasing him. She broke out of the alley onto the main street and let out a subdued scream, silenced by her gasping for breath. She turned back and he was standing in the alley. Still, his hoodie was dirty black and frayed at the ridge over his head. He was just standing there. Not today, then. Maybe tomorrow, he thought, and tuned away. Next time, you won't be as fast as you were this evening, and I will be faster, he convinced himself. He started to move slowly backwards into the shadow cast by the buildings and disappeared. The contrast of the main road lights and darkness of the alley was too much for Katherine's ill-adjusted eyes. She couldn't make out if the figure was still there or not. "I'll just go home and get this glass out of my foot. I won't make it to the station in this condition," she thought. People didn't help. They sneered at her as they pushed past. They could see she was struggling and something was wrong, but they were too caught up in an unreal electronic world in their hands. The stairs were harder than ever to climb, her hands slipping on the railing. Her grip was quickly failing her. She burst through her door feeling dizzy and faint. Maybe it was the extreme exertion or the blood loss. Then she saw them. The shoes she had left behind were on her coffee table, neatly tucked together, the buckles undone. Her heart sank and her eyes rolled back into her head as she slumped to the ground. "You are going to die from a cut," he said as he looked over her twitching body on the floor. He scooped her up easily and placed her on the sofa with her legs raised on the armrest. The blood was slowly dripping down and pooling on the floor. As he stood next to her body, he watched her chest move very lightly with every breath. Her breaths were getting lighter and lighter. He closed the open door, and she awoke suddenly. "My shoes," she said out loud. She felt a dull, stinging sensation in her foot, but felt so weak. "What are you doing in my house?" she softly asked the figure, but she was unable to stay focused for very long. He wrapped her foot in a towel he found in her bathroom. Frustration filled his body up. The joy of the hunt interrupted infuriated him, and without giving it a second thought, the words left his mouth. "I love you, Katherine." A sweet sentiment drenched in hatred. She was his perfect victim. The chase was perfect. He could still feel the blouse running over his fingers, flirting with his touch. He had been watching her for months. Unlike others, she was stronger. She didn't scream. She ran. She fought to stay alive. He slammed the window shut so that the latch closed. He thought of the other ones he was following. He would get his satisfaction from one of them in the meantime. He would wait for her, his dearest Katherine. She would probably forget the alley incident after a long day's work and take the shortcut again. This time he would grab her in a perfect ambush, and he would feast on the thrill of the chase and then the taste of her flesh, and he would share the spoils with his little friends. We hope that scared you a little. Remember to subscribe, and check out Creepy Midnight Stories for more.